So, hi guys. We are moving on with 4.5, and what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that you guys know about radicals and what it means to simplify them and all of that, and imaginary, and you're going to see how it applies to solving, okay? So last unit we solved and we said, okay, well when we have a polynomial, we can solve by looking at the graphs, or we can solve by factoring. And then there's a couple other ways that we can solve. In case the graph doesn't tell us all the information, and in case we cannot factor, because sometimes the numbers just don't work out, we can actually use this method, and then one other method that we're going to be talking about in the next couple lessons, okay? So this method is really solving with, that's a radical sign, so solving with square rooting, okay? And the only time that you can use this method is when you only have a y squared, like right here would be y squared. Well, in this case it works a little bit differently because you don't want to multiply it out. You can actually work it out in reverse this way. So I'll point out what I'm talking about in a second. So let's first just look at this one. Okay, and this one says 1/4 times y minus 6 squared equals 8, okay? So what you want to do is you want to isolate this y by undoing everything around it, just like you would solve an equation back in Algebra 1, okay? So the first thing we want to do is get rid of the 1/4, okay? So the way that we get rid of the 1/4 is we multiply both sides by that 4, because 4 and 1/4, they're multiplicative inverses, so they'll cancel. So we multiply both sides by that 4. That gets rid of the 1/4, so we're left with the y minus 6 squared, and then that becomes a 32. All right? Then, again, just like adding is the opposite of subtracting and dividing is the opposite of multiplying, okay? You want to ask yourself, well, what's the opposite of squaring something? Okay, well, the opposite of squaring something is square rooting. So we square root it because this square and that square root cancel each other out. Well, if we square root on the left side, we also want to square root on the right side. Okay, and that's where that's where this whole idea of simplifying square roots is going to come into play, because we know how that could work, okay? Or we know how that can simplify, can look better. So the square and the square root cancel, so we're left with y minus 6, okay? Now, when you square root a number, when you're going through and you're solving, you actually can have the positive or the negative version of that number, okay? Because, for example, like if I were to say, okay, 25. Well, if I were to say, let's say x squared is 25. So if I were to square root that, because these cancel, then the square root of 25 is a positive 5 or a negative 5, because a positive 5 times a positive 5 gives me 25, or a negative 5 and a negative 5 gives me 25, okay? There's also two answers, positive or negative, because if you think about it, whenever we have a squared in a problem, that means there's two solutions, just like there were 2 solutions or 3 solutions or however many last unit, okay? So this positive and negative helps us recognize two different answers, okay? So then we add 6 to both sides, because I still have a minus 6 right here. So I'm going to put that in front, and then plus or minus the square root of 32. Now this can simplify, okay? If you go through your factor pairs for 32, you only care about perfect squares. So the perfect squares that go into 32 are 4 and 8 and 16 and 2. Okay, and since 16 and 2 is the bigger pair, that means that I'm going to square root that. So let me just put this off to this up here real quick. So that's the square root of 16 times the square root of 2, and that square root of 16 becomes a 4, square root of 2. Okay, now we've been doing that a bunch of times over the past few classes. So So this plus or minus means the solutions are 6 plus 4 square roots of 2 and 6 minus 4 square roots of 2. But typically, we write it with plus or minus, and we just recognize you can either add 4 root 2 to get one answer, or you could subtract 4 root 2 and get the other answer. Okay? So that is how we can still solve. If you were to put this in your calculator, it would cross near where you see this decimal. If you were to get that decimal, it should cross around there, okay? All right, so now let's look at another time where you will square root. All right, well, and here we might square or square root. Let's see. Actually, no, it all has to do with square rooting because that's what we're looking at, is solving using those square roots. All right, so a water balloon is dropped from a window 59 feet above the sidewalk. How long does it take for the water balloon to hit the sidewalk? So here is the formula, okay? And I've seen this formula before. So, so it might be a formula that you might come across a bunch of times, okay? Substitute, let's see, the height is 59. And how long does it take to reach the ground, okay? Well, I'm trying to think of which one do they want for which. All right, so we want to know when it hits the ground. So that's 0. And it is starting, that's where it's starting. That's what H sub 0 means. It's starting at 59 degrees. So we want to put in 0 for H, so when it's at 0, when it hits the ground, and we're starting up at 59. So it's 59, it's the starting value, and that's how it's going to fall. That makes a little arc, like a parabola that we've been working with, okay? All right, so then, this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying, okay, the reason why we would square root in this problem is because there's no variable t. There's a t squared, so that's why we know we can square root, but since there's no t, then you don't have to worry about factoring or anything like that. You can just isolate the t squared, okay? So by isolating the t squared, that means we want to subtract 59 over here. And if you notice, I don't have any stuff with t around. All I have is t squared. So I subtract 59 first. Then to isolate the t squared more, I divide by negative 16. And 59 divided by negative 16 is just a fraction, 59 over 16. The negatives cancel. Okay? And then, because I just have my t squared, now I can square root that, okay? I can square root it because the opposite of squaring is square rooting. Well, whatever I do on the right side, so that they cancel, I have to do on the left side. So I get the square root of 59 over the square root of 16, and that works out nicely because we know the square root of 16 is 4. And a 4 in the denominator is great. They actually want it in decimal form because it's a real question. How long does it take for the water balloon to hit the sidewalk? Well, this is a real time, and you and I don't know what that means in time. So, it is, and whenever we square root, remember it's positive or negative. Okay, so I should have put a positive or negative up here. So if I were to put that in the calculator, I actually do get a decimal, and it is a little bit under 2 seconds, plus or minus 1.9. But then this says reject the negative solution, negative 1.9, because time must be positive. There's no such thing as a negative time. So the water balloon will fall at about 1.9 seconds. So almost 2 seconds and it would hit the ground. Okay, so if you're up at 59 feet and you were to throw it and it makes that curve, then it should take around just under 2 seconds to hit the ground. Okay. But again, we're just practicing squaring and square rooting, okay? Let me see if that's... All right, so that's what we want for these, where you're solving, you're still getting 2 answers, But the whole difference is that there's no middle term. There's no term that just has an exponent of 1. There's only a square term, so the opposite of squaring is square rooting. And that's what we're going to use to start solving, and that's why we've been practicing those square roots or radicals, okay? So, we'll practice with a couple of the others.